Welcome to the LSI Behind the Wind podcast. My name's Sean Slatter, and for 30 years, I've dedicated my life to the science of business development. I've seen the impact of our work, which has evolved into economic development and now social impact. Today, I have asked Josh Johnson to join me again to talk about the recently enacted Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It was signed into law by the president on the 15th of November, and it is huge. And it's going to be a huge opportunity for business development in some certain areas tied to infrastructure. I think the total on this act for funding was over $1.2 trillion. It's one of the largest acts in history, and it really is going to impact a lot of our work over the next few years. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for companies to capture a piece of this $1.2 trillion workload. So, as I said, I've asked Josh to join me and discuss some strategies for this opportunity. And Josh had joined me early on in this series. Josh has an interesting history, spending over 20 years in the Congress. He had 10 years serving in the House and 10 years serving in the Senate, and has been working a lot of congressional initiatives and policy work for us, including leading our legislative strategy and tying all of that to business development. So, Josh, thanks for being with me again this morning. Do you want to just, before we talk about this new act, just give another quick background on you and your career?
Sure. Thanks for having me today. So as Sean, as you stated, I spent close to 20 years up in the Congress, of which I did focus a lot on infrastructure. And so a lot of the positions I held were on committees authorizing side that were authorizing infrastructure projects in the water sector, energy sector, and then there was a crossover with defense-related projects that were more on islanding of military facilities and how do you ensure that they can operate in times of disaster or when issues occur with their infrastructure, particularly on the power side. And so this bill is a bill that I know many folks are interested in finding out more about, and also how do they go about getting the money that's being allocated. So it's a pleasure to be here.
And Josh, you wrote a lot of legislation during your 20 years in the Congress. Have you ever seen anything like this 1.3 trillion, which is, and the reality of it is it is a follow-on to the $2.3 trillion plan that the president rolled out in March. And so you and I have been talking about this for more than 6 months now, anticipating this was going to happen. It finally did on the 15th of November of this year, 2021. Have you ever seen any kind of legislation that is even close to this in your 25-year, 30-year history of working with the Congress?
Yeah, I think the closest came when we did have in the latter part of the early 2000s, when we were starting to see a lot of issues associated with the economy occurring and those stimulus packages that were occurring over those years. But it really is, for infrastructure, an area that we haven't seen, and there's been a need for years to address a lot of the infrastructure related issues. So if you look at it from both on the authorizing side, as many are aware, the Congress has all these committees that authorize the government to spend money. The challenge is you can have something authorized and everybody can get excited, but there's no dollars put to it. So what these acts that we're seeing coming through are doing are pushing money to actually build what either has been authorized or projects that have a history. And so what I always recommend on these types of projects are anything out there that people have done initial studies on, that have some early framework, or even the more the better. I mean, as the last time we did this, going back many years, what occurred is basically all these projects that had studies done were the first in line to get funding because they had already spent the time to do it. So just as people listen to this, I would really start to pull together all the projects, whether they're, city, state, whatever they might be, and start to get them in order so that when these fundings come out, that they have documentation and are ready to start to put jobs in place. That's what they're looking for on these types of acts.
So this is a very complex program, and we're going to walk through this, try to break it down so that if you are the business development lead for your company, or you're looking at how, as a government entity, either a state or municipal entity, how you're going to play into this, because it really is going to be a lot of public and private workload in the implementation of this act. And I think talk about for a minute your assessment of, now that the act has been signed by the president, there's going to be a lot of decisions made on what agencies are going to manage and have oversight for these initiatives. And as you and I have talked about for months, this really is going to be one of those acts that all of the agencies are going to touch. It's going to go into the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, Department of Labor, Health and Human Services. I mean, there is going to be a lot of agencies that are going to receive funding and be working oversight and implementation for these programs. Do you want to talk about that for just a second?
Sure. So on this, you have to always remember that it is infrastructure monies, but it's jobs as well. Jobs. So again, as people start to think about how they're going to go get this, they really have to have their, what the direction they want to be going, and can show how that's going to lead to improvements in a variety of policy areas, but also in jobs. And so I'll just kind of walk through some of the numbers, and I hate to throw out a lot of numbers, but I think it's helpful.
I think what you've done in this analysis of the bill and then now the act is critical, because it's so complex and such a $1.3 trillion. It's incredible. Yeah, what you're so good at, Josh, is breaking down these complex acts into some buckets.
So if you look at that number, let's start out with the 1.2 trillion. So that is a number that they're using over the next 10 years of the investment that's going to be going out under this act. And so breaking that down a little further, 550 billion will be in new spending. And new spending is always hard to get authorized as well as put out. So it's a large amount of money that's going for new projects that are out there. So when you say what pots of money and where it's going to be going, you can break it down that basically over the next 5 years, the 550 billion that they're looking in new spending, that about half of it's going to go to surface transportation. So in this case, it's going to be close to $280+ billion. And then infrastructure, the core infrastructure is 266 billion. And we'll break that down a little more. So if you're thinking of what is that, when we talk transportation, what are, the $284 billion, it entails several areas. And so that includes roads, bridges, and major projects, which a lot of folks are familiar with, kind of that surface transportation. $110 billion is in the roads, bridges, and projects.
So that's about 10%. 10% of the total spending, and 20% of the new spending is just going to roads and bridges, so traditional civil engineering projects.
Yeah, and that's over the next 5 years. So the 5 years, I'm only doing the
Wow.
first 5 year horizon. So the numbers, so if we look at what I'm going to be providing, it's really just this first 5 years, which is a little easier to anticipate with things going on and changes. So yes, that's 100 of the 284 going for the basic, what we understand transportation. 66 billion is for passenger and freight rail. So for those states that have a pretty robust system in place and are looking at new, areas to focus on, that's going to be the bulk of that. 42 billion for airports, ports, and waterways, and then 39 billion for public transit. And then you get into some policy related issues. Well, granted, a lot of this is policy. When you talk about rails, you talk about public transit, you have also electric vehicles. And so there's an opportunity here for folks who are interested in improving the infrastructure as it relates to electric vehicle infrastructure, buses, and transit. So there's, a priority with this administration to focus in on that. And there's $15 billion set aside for projects dealing with that. And then you just have, another pot, which is on safety, which we can get a little more into. And that's, safe streets, community crashes and fatalities. I mean, it gets into, again, these are more policy related issues, but that's the extent right now that we're looking at as transportation. Now, when we talk core infrastructure, this is getting more into the water, environment, energy, and broadband. So that's 266 billion, again, looking over this horizon of 5 years. So they're estimating that it's going to be about 73 billion for power infrastructure and grid automation. So that's, improving, the electricity to a variety of communities, to rural areas, making sure that the grid has its protections in place, et cetera. And also, how do you go about integrating renewable energy into the system, which is always a challenge. Is many cases where you have capability for renewable energy, you don't necessarily have a lot of people in those areas, or it's generated at times in which you don't really need it. You need it in times in which, so for example, wind, a lot of it's generated at night. You need it during the day. So how do you start to address these inconsistencies to ensure that you can start to place these renewable energy loads into the system and not cause challenges, as well as potentially battery storage to allow for savings of the power. An example would be when you look at a lot of the river systems are run where they are releasing from the facilities during the day for power generation, and at nighttime they want to, they're pumping back into the systems in order for the next day to be able to release water back into the system as well to generate energy. So those are issues that are going to be found within this. There is going to be a lot for broadband. And so when $65 billion is what they're anticipating. And that's, of course, on how do you get infrastructure to everybody, or as much as they can, recognizing the amount, making sure that it's cost effective, that people can afford to take what they get. Most of the areas that don't have it are not necessarily areas where folks have the income to put it to them, or maybe not even the amounts to pay for it once it's there. And so that's where you get into a variety of the challenges of how do you get everybody connected, and particularly these underserved areas. And if I recall, this presidency has indicated that 65% or more than half of it's going to go to underserved areas, which again, we can get into at a later time, where more than half of that money is going to go to is considered these underserved areas, which have their own formulas on what that means. So that's the broadband side. Then you get into water infrastructure. And again, so when people think of this, it's just not transportation. This is an infrastructure bill. So some of these areas people might not think at first that are important, but they tie to every state, city, locality out there. Water infrastructure is about 55 billion.
Wow.
And that's going to go to, you have a whole issue with lead pipes. That's in areas. Again, some of these are policy. Remember, some of these have policy directives in there. So there have been concerns in certain urban areas that they have a variety of lead pipe related issues. And they also have issues associated with how some of these state revolving funds are being allocated to states to address their infrastructure. So that, think of it as more going to localities and states to then distribute to fix some of their related issues. Now, a word that you're going to hear a lot with this administration, and it's been building over the past, I'd say 10 years, but a lot of their focus is on what they call resiliency. And in this case, they're calling it environmental resiliency. $47 billion to go to that. And what that means is kind of what I spoke about earlier. One of my jobs in the Congress was, how do you ensure that a military facility, if it has a power outage, could stay on for longer than the diesel power that they have to fill their generators? Or how do you ensure that you're not going to have a cyber attack that's going to impact the facility? And so these monies, although they're called environmental resiliency, are looking at ensuring that infrastructure is protected from cyber attacks. So for clients who have cyber related capabilities, and also from storms and other natural disasters that may occur. Now, they would argue in this case that it's climate change, but the broad category is called environmental resiliency. I think it's really interesting and something that will pay huge dividends as we start to reduce our dependency upon, having power that's available in the locality always, rather than depending upon power, in this case, fuels being brought into communities or generators being brought into communities to bring them back up once a disaster hits. And then finally, under this, you just have they call it environmental remediation, which includes super funds. So if I recall, I think it's about 1,200 sites that need money to address legacy pollution issues. In many cases, these are in areas that are underserved areas or in areas where it's starting to has impacted the water as well as the usable land. So those are the two main areas. Again, the core infrastructure and then the transportation dollars, which equate up to that.
Josh, that was fantastic. That was such a great summary of this very complex act. Maybe let me see if I can summarize this. So what you talked about in my mind, and maybe you can push back on this a little bit, but in my mind, there's really 4 buckets, and maybe we can consolidate this even into 3. So there's the traditional civil engineering work, which would be things like roads, bridges, rail, airports, port infrastructure, right? So that's all traditional civil engineering. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I think you're right. They do argue that electric vehicles would be put on infrastructure for that, into that sector, but I see that as a newer component. But they're putting that onto the traditional kind of the transportation spending. But it's you're correct. That electric vehicles is just the oddity that how do you go about that infrastructure with that?
So then the second bucket I see is utilities, right? So it would be power, infrastructure, you mentioned, broadband, which is going to be huge, and then things like water. There's a lot of water, both policy and fiscal appropriation tied to water, which this is one of your subject matter and specialties that you spend a lot of time working water issues. And I want to come back to that in a minute. I want to come back to your history on water because you've got this incredible background in water. But is that what you see as well in this second bucket? So things like power infrastructure, grid modernization, you mentioned, broadband,
and then that climate umbrella, that resiliency. So I really like this. I think that if you're looking at projects, anytime you can build in, how do you make the funding be on utilities and kind of the energy side, using resiliency as a positive that we can, whatever problem is there, we have the means to bring the grid up and ensure that it's not going to go down because of a cyber attack, that you can island off, the facility, so it's not bringing down the operations of that facility. And then the only other thing would be that the long-term environmental remediation issues that we face as a country because of decisions that were rightly made in many ways, but at the time not known how it would impact.
Exactly. So the third bucket that you talked about is transportation, which pure transportation, not the civil engineering side, but the transportation such as rail, public transit, some things like you mentioned transportation safety programs, right? So that I see that is a third bucket, right? And then I want to talk about this policy piece because maybe it's not a fourth category, but rather both government entities and the private sector needs to be incorporating this across whatever these projects are. And you had mentioned policy, so things like all of the environmental resiliency, cyber, electric vehicles. Would you see that as its own category, or do you just think that is actually incorporated into these three buckets of civil engineering, utilities, and transportation?
So it is, what they're doing is weaving it into all of the funding criteria. And so, for example, they will say, this administration, that we need to upgrade roads and bridges to address climate change and resilience. And so we need more EV to address climate change. So you will see resiliency, which could be in many cases, you could say climate change, but resiliency has kind of been something in which is caught on with a variety of people, that they understand better what resiliency means than just saying climate change. So you're going to see a lot of that in those core buckets. Now, what's nice about that is when people are addressing projects is to look at that, because that's going to be a requirement in almost any issue. Is why we do mass transit? Well, to get cars off. Why are we doing rail? Why are we doing electric vehicles? Well, to use less fuel. Why are we doing public, the public transit, the buses, et cetera? So you're going to see that, as well as why do we care that I live, to have renewable energy? Well, again, it's to reduce our use of different types of, fossil fuel or, fossil fuels, et cetera. So I see that if you can look at an eye on all this funding, and that's been one of the criticisms of the bill by some, is that it's directed a lot of policy ingrained into how this is going to be, the money's going to be allocated. And it just comes down to it, I think, tying, what people are doing with the end state of being, why is this better for the community as a whole, and to recognize that those policy issues are going to be driven into a majority of those decisions.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting opportunities if you're both a government entity, a state, municipal entity, and also if you are a private sector entity. And I'd like to talk for a minute about some of these strategies. But before we do, let's look at each of these three buckets again really quickly. Civil engineering, that's going to be traditional A&E type work in construction. So there's a lot of engineering. And keep in mind that the objective of this act and the funding is job creation, right? So there's likely going to be a requirement to discuss, if you're a public or a private entity, how many jobs are tied to these projects? How many people did you hire, or did you, if you're a government entity, if you're a public entity, how many jobs were created as a result of this? You're seeing that as well? Is that what you're saying, Josh?
Yeah, I think the narrative should always be that, they have found that while these types of acts go through during times when there's issues, with folks out of work or folks that are needing, communities needing money coming into them, that infrastructure projects are a quick way to put money doing something good, but also for the jobs. I do have a thought though, Sean. You had mentioned the agencies, and I think it would be helpful. This might help to folks understand when you're talking about the full amount of money, who are the major agencies. So if we're looking at that, going the first 5 years, the bulk of that money is going to go to the Department of Transportation. So about almost, like $270 billion. Of that, just to give you an idea, there are monies that go out as a grant formula that states get monies based upon a formula, and it doesn't change much, and it just goes to every state based on a formula. But more money is going to be going under this for grants in a competitive basis than under grant formulas to states. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunity of these competitive grants that are going to be going out more so than just your traditional funding. So that's the Department of Transportation, though EPA is the second largest. So you go from 274 billion for those transportation related projects down to $67 billion, which is the EPA, of which the bulk of that money is grants formula based. So there are some competitive grants that are going to be in the term, say 12, $13 billion, but the bulk of that 67 billion is just going to go automatically to states or under formulas, I should say, how that will be allocated. And then from there you have, you drop.
Let me interrupt you, Josh.
Go ahead.
Sorry, let me interrupt you. And so the process of this is, now that the act has been passed, it's the working with the various committees. The Department of Treasury will take this $1.2 trillion and start pushing it to the major agencies. And I know it's still early in this, but will the agencies then push that money to the state and municipal entities? Or it's probably more likely that these entities will be required to submit a proposal for these grants that the agency will push. Is that your assessment as well?
Yeah, so that's going to it'll be interesting when they tie that in. So as you described, for example, grants are going to be likely given to state and local governments, based on formulas. And then
that will come out of Department of Transportation and DOD and HHS and DOL, right? Or
yeah.
Okay.
So each agency will have a mechanism to send their formula-based grants and then their competitive-based grants. And again, the agencies that you described, really the major players, Department of Transportation, but EPA and DOE are similar in many ways on amounts, but not on how it's to be allocated. DOE, Department of Energy, is about 63 billion. A lot of the resiliency, renewable energy type related work is going to go out of the Department of Energy under competitive grants. And so when I say competitive grants, these are going to be awarded potentially likely to states and local governments, and then that on a competitively. So these communities and states are going to be applying for this, as well as depending on what other types of organizations can go after it, to then either to win it and then bid it out to do the work that they want, or so those are requirements that will be state driven. When you get down to Department of Commerce, a lot of that money is it's just going to states to then spend under their formula base. So like $51 billion is going to commerce, but there's not going to be a lot of new, I don't want to say new approaches, but where it's going to be competitive grants. When you get into the Department of Interior, you're doing $28 billion. And so there's a lot of work that's going to be, grants competitives, as well as, for example, the Department of Homeland Security is a little more than half is going to go for grants, competitive grants. And that's only $8 billion. So if you're looking at agencies to really focus in on, it's going to be the Department of Transportation, EPA, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, and Department of Interior.
And, you're throwing this out. Yeah, it's only 28 billion. It's only 8 billion. I mean, those were major programs. Those were major funding opportunities 2 years ago, and now we're talking about it like, oh well, yeah, it's only 28 billion. But okay, so the primary customer, when you're looking, if you're a public entity or a private entity and you're looking at capture, who is your customer? The primary customer that you need to be focused on in your capture strategy and building out your capture plan, the primary entities will be Department of Transportation. You think EPA next, right?
Yeah, and Department of Energy.
DOE, Department of Energy, Commerce, maybe, or do you think Commerce is secondary?
Well, the thing that's going to be interesting is because the states are going to be receiving these grants purely based, for example, Department of Commerce, the bulk of that's just going directly to state governments to then allocate. So not on that, they are formula based for specific purposes. So those are having the relationships in the states and recognizing priorities of the states from both what they're currently getting their money to spend on, as well as then going to this issue of competing with other states and localities for additional money. That's where that opens up these new lines of funding, new projects that really start to open up doors for folks to be working with the states or companies that can address the challenges that states are having or localities are having within these areas. And that's going to be based on kind of population size, metrics, formulas, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of those will have their own special requirements when they're open for competition in order to compete for. So we'll be having to keep a close eye on those competitive grants, how each of those agencies and programs are going to be pushing that money out as.
Yeah, that's a great point. So this will be an interesting capture strategy and plan where you are looking at opportunities with federal entities, and then you're also going to be looking at state and municipal entities as well, based on where the funding goes. And I know you and your team track this meticulously during the CARES Act and all of the subsequent COVID funding, stimulus funding. What I loved about what you and your team was doing was at every phase, you were looking at what funding was being pushed from the Treasury to what agencies, what federal agencies, and then what state entities as well. And so if anyone has an interest of what that funding looks like and the policy itself, we can help put that together. But I think that's a great point. Many organizations may have worked with municipal entities or have worked with state entities and not federal entities. And then I know that there's a lot of our clients and a lot of entities that have only worked with federal customers and never with state and municipal entities. And it's a very different strategy that I want to just talk about in a minute. This has been fantastic. So when you're looking at a capture strategy or capture plan, be thinking about the big customers are going to be Department of Transportation, EPA, Department of Energy, maybe Commerce and Department of Interior, and then the state and municipal entities collectively are going to have a huge piece of this. And then second, some of the secondary customers that we need to be looking at is Department of Defense, HHS.
You could put in there health and human services will fall under that. They're going to be getting,
DHS. SBA is, I know, is part of Commerce. The FAA, you mentioned airports, so that would fall under ports in general. Airports and ports will fall under Commerce, I'm assuming.
So Sean, really quick, a thought for folks as well as of the $73 billion that's going to power infrastructure and grid automation, almost a third of that's going for clean energy technology. So when you start thinking of who should care about that, are all these companies that are producing solar panels, that are doing projects in carbon capture and sequestration, all the technologies, all the components that are required, all the tubes, all the lines, all the cables, everything that is in those industries. This is any industry that's making something that, even homes that can be tied down, that are, little devices for anchoring roofs, to, for natural disasters, to companies that focus in on cyber attacks and have looked at utilities. I mean, you can really get into a lot of non-traditional clients now are going to have large pots of money to go after. So anybody in the renewable energy sector, whatever type of technology they're looking at, really has a larger play than they've had, because the government's, even though they've subsidized this, it hasn't been to this extent. And most utilities can't afford to say, yeah, we're going to put in a bunch of clean energy technology, because they can't push it to their end users to pay for. So we really have to think, and going even on the digital side, the broadband, all these telecommunications companies that are public, private, that are out there, who are going to be the ones that are going to be putting the lines in, the cables in, whatever it might be, et cetera. So we can start to break down the types of people outside of just who could get the money, the types of companies that, once the money is who was awarded to, can then compete to become the supplier or the execute what that money is for.
I love that. Okay, so going back to the three buckets that we started talking about, the first one, civil engineering, all of the roads, bridges, airports, and rail. Your primary customer is going to be Department of Transportation and a little bit of Commerce. I would suspect that the airports are going to fall under FAA, the ports will be under Commerce. But a lot of that, and this is the bulk of this funding, will be allocated to Department of Transportation and state and local entities. You agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Then moving into the utilities bucket, which again is power, infrastructure, broadband, drinking water, all these water issues. Now you're looking at your major capture strategy, who your customer and decision makers will really is going to be Department of Energy, EPA, a little bit of Commerce, state and local, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you about broadband. We have seen a lot of broadband work in our rural economic development initiatives. And do you think the funding and oversight is going to come out of Commerce, probably EDA?
Good question. So of that broadband money, which was, $65 billion for broadband, 65%, so more than half of that is designated, so allocated to connect underserved areas. So we'll get a better sense of who are the underserved areas, what that criteria looks like to be identified as an underserved areas. I mean, they play around a lot, different administrations, on how they term it, but it's generally, folks that, meet a certain formula of the population base, et cetera. So 65% is going to be focused on that. So that includes both rural and urban areas. And so we'll have to filter out who is going to, how that funding is going to be allocated to who, and who are and we can map out pretty quickly the communities that fall under that criteria, so folks can start to talk to those communities and providers of services in those areas.
I love it. Okay, and then the third bucket, transportation, public transit, rail, transportation safety. I guess we'd lump electric vehicles in there, maybe. I guess.
I think so on this, because their intent on electric vehicles is just to get be focusing in on the charging structure, as well as moving a lot of the current buses to, net zero pollution. So that's where you'll see a lot of that type of money filtering in and requirements into those agencies.
So a lot of this will be transportation, state and municipal entities as the primary customer in this play, right?
Huh?
And then did you see specific appropriations? I know there's policy. Is there a specific appropriations in the act for some of the tangent things that we talked about, the policy issues like environmental? I know there is for water and soil. We talked about that. But how about other cleaning up Superfund sites and things like that? And then resiliency. And you also mentioned cyber.
Yeah, so I think you're going to see it like for airports and waterways, you're going to see a focus on communities that are addressing the climate related impacts. And so there is money that will be going for waterways to counter extreme weather, for bridges to counter extreme weather, for roads to counter extreme weather. So you're going to see that language really in a variety of areas that will probably be prioritized, as well as resiliency, to counter challenges. So just keep in mind that that is going to be, how much in the end is the requirement will be is one thing, but to really the narrative, I think, on a lot of these projects is to start to show how, and we can do up a little thing on some of the policy related issues of kind of the narrative on that to ensure that, that you're speaking the language that is likely going to be driven through all the requirements for these monies.
I love it. I've got a couple of other questions that I'd like your opinion on this. One is this electric vehicle issue. Tell me again what the total funding was for electric vehicle, like 15 billion?
Yeah, 15 billion. That includes infrastructure for it and buses and transit. So the terminology that they're using is they want to build a national network of EV chargers along highways and in rural and disadvantaged communities. So think of it as a means to which that they do a variety of investments in those areas. And then the second thing is tied to how do you get buses, particularly school and transit buses, to be electric, and even going into the aspect of transportation by ferry. So there is going to be a lot of investment of who can come up with the best design and best type of technology for charging across the country. And those companies that are really playing a role in that there's a lot of opportunity there.
And although it's one of the smallest categories that you mentioned, it's only 15 billion of the 1.3 trillion. Think about, this is a commodity for the most part, right? It is a commodity. This is a lot of money that is going to be spent on electric vehicles. Remember, we did a project a few years ago on electric vehicles with a client, with a very large Fortune 500 client. And our team did just fantastic work in researching what public entities have owned vehicles. So exactly what you were talking about. You think about the Department of Defense and how many vehicles the Department of Defense owns, how many vehicles these other federal entities like HHS and state municipal entities. There are thousands of vehicles that are owned by these entities. Do you see that a lot of this $15 billion will be divided between federal and state entities that have huge fleets of vehicles today? Is that how you see that being allocated?
Well, I do know for schools, no question. So I do think it ties into for buses, et cetera. So I'll have to dig deeper into the policy.
I know it's still early. I know we're still trying to just, I think what you've done, and you and your team have done this amazing job of breaking down these thousands of pages and line items to a few key buckets. I love what you're doing with this.
Well, one thing, Sean, that I failed to mention, because it doesn't show up as a large amount per se, if you're thinking of the under the core infrastructure, and this is on the renewable and grid automation and
Yes.
getting into some of these variety of things and broadband, there is going to be about $5 billion for initiatives through ARPA, through advanced research projects, and for grants that would be company specific, that would be research foundations, that are, universities that are focusing on early stage work. So if you're thinking of a lot of the renewable energy, a lot of the electric vehicle, batteries, et cetera, just in that little pot, excluding how those fall into other pots, they've allocated $5 billion to do that. And that's where you would just come in, that when we're talking clusters, collaborations, and companies that have the greatest thing, but it's the size of a small bottle cap, how do you make that bottle cap into something that can power a community or whatever it might be, or charge a community? That's about $5 billion. So you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars a year, right, going out for companies to compete for these projects that these agencies are going to be doing.
It's remarkable. So you're saying some of the ARPA and Build Back Better funding will also be linked into this new act.
Yeah, and they're calling it would be the advanced. So rather than Advanced Research Projects Agency, so ARPA, ARPA, but they're saying for infrastructure. So $5 billion. So just think of ARPA I. ARPA I is for any company that has creative ideas to address utilities, transportation, whatever it might be. That's going to be the incubator that's being, close to $5 billion to be doing that type of work, excluding, again, folks that already are in those sectors that have developed stuff that can be used immediately to further, renewable clean energy technology, et cetera, or broadband investments, whatever it might be.
Before we go into the strategy for public and private entities, I want to just talk about water, because this really is one of your subject matter expertise, and a lot of your career was looking at energy and natural resources, which is going to be such a big part of this. Do you want to talk for a minute about water in particular? I'm really interested in your thoughts on some of these initiatives tied to drinking water, soil and water remediation, and water storage in Western states. All of those things are really unique in incorporating the policy and the appropriation into this overall bill. We've been looking at a lot of water issues for years and have worked water initiatives for years. Do you want to talk about the water element of this for a minute? Because I think it is a fascinating element of this act.
Yeah. So, if you're looking at what arguably falls in that category, it's close to the 266 billion impacts associated with, how water addresses a variety of those, plays a lot in the type of technologies you use for renewable energy. So when you're talking about, improving your grid, water is input into many things. And people don't recognize that in production of energy, whatever type of energy it might be, the amount of water that's needed. So if you're talking about a particular solar technology that depends upon water for a variety of reasons, then you have to start thinking about where you're going to be placing that, where you have a water supply. So I just want people to understand that water is embedded in so many things, and in many cases, just when you're looking at your business operations, one of the larger costs is water, heating of water, et cetera, and movement of water. So when we talk water infrastructure, in this case, it's estimated, $50 some odd billion going towards funding and they use words like modernize water infrastructure. And that gets into, we have a lot of systems that are, for a variety of reasons, we still have in certain areas water systems that are wood-based, that are moving water down kind of flumes. And so it's really interesting and some of them are actually, you can't upgrade them because they're historic. So when you get into the types of projects that they're going to be addressing, a lot of it will be state driven through state revolving, funds process. But a lot of the infrastructure is needing to be modernized. And so anything that can be done from, moving water through communities without upsetting the neighborhood above, to taking out lead pipes, to how do you improve the efficiency or operations for facilities that are using a lot of water, etc. But it ties in where a lot of people kind of don't recognize is that a lot of the environmental remediation that we're doing is to ensure that you don't have these challenges with the chemicals or whatever may have been used getting into the groundwater. And we see that a lot throughout the country where you have what they call Superfund sites, which, right now, if I understand right, I think there's over 1,200 of these sites that basically they're unusable for a variety of reasons, right, until you reclaim them. And a lot of them are projects that have been abandoned. Right. So the number that they use quite often is about almost a quarter of the population lives within 2 to 3 miles of a Superfund site. So when you start talking about a quarter, a fifth to a quarter of the population living by these, and if there is degradation of the soils or water that comes about it, then you have the costs associated with cleaning it up. So I see environmental remediation, tied not necessarily to building out the water infrastructure, but to ensuring that water infrastructure can handle what might be in the system or coming into the system as we go along. So that's the environmental remediation with water infrastructure is close to $100 billion. Right. So it's a lot of money going into these types.
We sort of brushed over this in the beginning, but what's incredible, it's actually, water is actually the biggest part of the new spending. Of that $550 billion in new spending, you think about drinking water at $55 billion, Western water storage, and I want to ask you about that in a minute, was $50 billion, and then remediation was $20 billion. Was that right? $21 billion?
Yeah. Remediation was $47 billion.
Gosh. So, we're talking
about... I'm sorry. That's environmental resiliency. Yeah, remediation was $21 billion.
$21 billion. Okay, so we're talking about 126 billion. It's actually, I don't know how much of that remediation is soil, but I would suspect the majority of it is water. So you're talking about $126 billion of new spending just going to water. That's more than the roads and bridges. It's more than the A&E work. So this is one of the biggest water initiatives that I can remember in my career. I know you've worked a lot of policy around water. I think it's an incredible opportunity, and I cannot ever remember another policy or appropriation of this magnitude. Maybe you can.
Yeah, so when you're looking at what we consider your basic water infrastructure, which is just what you see and what you use, what they've done under this bill is there's a basic formula that goes out to states, that a funding formula that states are going to get every year. And what they did in this bill is they increased it by 3 times what the historical, appropriation has been for these state revolving funds. So states are going to see immediately a lot of money going into what many of us think is your water infrastructure. But then you get into priority areas, really focusing in on some of these areas where we should have been modernizing and just haven't had the funding for. And then, as you described, a lot of the environmental remediation is for, soils and brownfield sites. But what we have found is the reason why you got to clean those up is to make people livable and can improve the environment. But a lot of this does leak through into the groundwater. And so it's directly impacted by these sites, of which is, described, where you have, close to, a quarter of the population living by these. One other thought on the water technologies, which there's a variety of folks people work with that are really looking at how do you get these chemicals out of these waters, or how do you take the chemicals out of the water? And you see that along the Colorado River all the way into California, that there's high levels at different parts of the Colorado River of different, both chemicals that are created naturally, and then chemicals that were created for a variety of reasons that are found themselves into the river and then found themselves into a lot of the ground basins, particularly in Southern California. So you do see direct impacts on what people are paying for water by how expensive it is, if you can even do it, taking out the chemicals that have leached into the water systems.
Well, and I mean, that's a great point. Think about a lot of what DOD is dealing with in the PFAS and PFAS remediation. It ultimately is it's all water. I mean, you think about some of these installations and the challenges that they have in remediation, but ultimately that's going to be a water issue. So that'll be very interesting to watch in how that huge amount of funding is allocated, because it overlaps right into drinking water, into the remediation itself.
Well, and Sean, even a step further on that is they have, water is sucked up into the food we eat. And so you have a variety of folks that argue that they're starting to see issues associated with food production based upon what the plants are drinking and what then we're consuming. And so there's just a lot of science that is growing dramatically. But and from a policy perspective, you can imagine when you start tying in policy issues of certain things we're seeing in humans, certain things we're seeing, in other populations, that, water is playing a role in those discussions.
No question. This has been such a great discussion, and there's still a lot that we need to cover. But just quickly, could you talk about this huge amount of funding that will be going to Western water storage? You and I both have followed the drought in the West now for whoever. There's a lot of arguments on how long this has been going on and what really constitutes the Western drought, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. But I mean, there's clearly this drought. We have supported a lot of and consulted for a lot of entities that have had response to the fires, to the other fallout from this drought. I'm so fascinated by this $50 billion going into Western water storage. What do you think that looks like in your mind? Because of your history and your expertise in Western water issues.
So I'll kind of start historically, and then I've not seen the specific projects yet for the Western reclamation, but I can give you an idea of what's been happening. So a lot of the West was developed. Why the water is in the West is because of these reclamation projects. So you had, in order to get people to live in the Western United States, the federal government had to build these massive projects. And so they invested at that time heavily in the dams and power facilities along the Colorado River, Columbia River. You can name almost every major river system. Reclamation. Yeah, your reclamation project is in almost every Midwest and Western states.
Yep.
So what's happened is a lot of those were built 100 years ago. I mean, we're talking some of the first major infrastructure projects the United States built were to build these projects so people had power and water as they moved west in order to ensure that the United States, people lived in the entire United States. So without them, we wouldn't have, and so the argument is without these projects, you wouldn't have large populations like we do now. The issue now has occurred is some people have argued that the traditional way of developing water isn't good. And you see that through people who criticize dams for impacting endangered species, dams for impacting recreation, dams for, so you can start to go through a whole list of policy related issues that different administrations try to address. So when we talk about development of water infrastructure going forward, a lot of the conversation's been is how do you take and reclaim water that is sitting in areas where the water might have a variety of contaminations, or how do you improve the efficiency of water operations, or how do you move water from one source that currently has endangered species issues to another source to move the water elsewhere. And that entails, investment. And to give you an idea, I mean, there's always talk about the, conversation about moving water right now what happens in California, you move water through river systems to then go to large pumps that move the water over a mountain down to Southern California. So 2/3 of the water in California is developed in Northern California, and 2/3 of the water is needed in Southern California. So in order to get it there, you have to pump it. But in pumping it, you're impacting a variety of things. The flows of water coming into the bay, from the ocean, you're impacting water coming through the rivers, and you're impacting every time you turn those pumps on, it's creating arguably an unnatural process for that system, but they need it in order to move it. So a lot of the conversation when we talk about Western water infrastructure is how do you do things that are smarter and better and cost effective? And there's a variety of solutions, but you still have this tug of war between people that say we just need more storage on rivers. It's easier to put a system there than to pump water down into what we think is an aquifer that's safe, or to build expensive reclamation projects, desalination. So you have desalination of ocean water and you have desalination of brackish water. So those are generally on land. So how do you take salts out of waters that are in New Mexico or Arizona or California, recycle it, and then use it for either drinking or for watering lands or agriculture? So those are all the types of things that when you hear about Western water reclamation projects through Department of Interior, which is going to be close to $28 billion in funding going to Department of Interior. So there's a lot of heavy investment there from both improving the operations at facilities and rethinking how we have built projects to improve the efficiency of water to, protect the environment, protect, a variety of things. And so those are the policy debates you're going to see as that language moves and that those projects move along.
That is really, of this act, that water element is going to be fascinating to watch. There is a huge amount of funding going into this, but there's going to be some real challenges in working through the environmental issues, all of the policy issues, the water treaty issues with the rivers, tribal issues. I mean, this is going to be just an absolutely fascinating decade-long study in what's going to happen for commerce, policy, resiliency, environmental. It really is I think the people that I've talked with about the act and the funding, they've glossed over this water piece. And I just want to reemphasize, this is a big part of this act and the appropriation tied to it that is going to be so interesting to watch. Do not discount or gloss over that element of the act itself. Okay, so we really wanted to talk about now the strategy tied to it. And while this is still early in the process, let's just talk about an early capture strategy and capture planning, both if you're a public entity and if you're a private entity. We talked a little bit about identifying your customers and starting down that path. And really, in both cases, if you're a public entity or if you're a private entity, you need to be building good capture strategies and capture plans, because as we had talked about, how a lot of this funding is going to be work is through grants. That means you better have now, you better be planning for how are we going to capture this funding, and who is the customer, what is the decision chain that needs to happen. And starting now, it's not too early to start in writing your grants for this. I mean, talk about, I think the capture piece of this is going to be very similar for both public and private entities. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. I mean, again, I'll just use the section on, kind of I don't want to say the utility side of what's happening in this. Every single company that does, broadband or, sort of, the internet, et cetera, they should care about this because there is more money than ever coming into this. When you're looking at cities and communities that are in these underserved areas, there is going to be a large focus on getting them utilities as well as surface transportation related projects as well. So when you're thinking about who should care in the energy side, think about every utility, think about every company that provides utilities with something. And just alone of the $21 billion going to clean energy technology.
Absolutely.
So that is a lot of money for, in highlighting, hundreds of companies that focus in on clean energy right now. That's a whole host of companies that could become, who should be care about this, and where we could work with them on their municipalities as well as states or the utilities where they're going to be focusing in on. In addition to any company that has research arms or research foundations or cluster work we want to do that is energy related, cyber related, resiliency related, dealing with, things in which we see as climate's changing, what are clever ways to approach these challenges. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars to companies that previously were not as competitive as others because there wasn't funding for them. This bill opens up a lot of that.
And Josh, I loved what you said about clusters. We have done so much work over the last 10 years, more, 20 years in cluster development and ecosystem development. And some of these earlier episodes and future episodes that we're going to push, it is tied to this concept of ecosystem and cluster development. There is such an opportunity if you are a public entity to build out these ecosystems in engineering, in construction, in all of the A&E, transportation, the port system, broadband, cyber, water, transportation, these buckets that we talked about, building clusters where you have large and small entities coming together to create jobs. And this is what this is about. So if you are a public entity, if you are a state, municipal entity, and you are looking at how do I create jobs in a rural part of my state, or I'm a economic development entity in a state municipal organization, this is what we're talking about, creating ecosystems around these buckets: civil engineering, utilities, transportation, and then some of the policy things, environmental resiliency, technology tied to things like cyber and electric vehicles. That's the real opportunity. That's the kind of thinking and the preparation that we mean if you're a public entity, creating a capture strategy and capture plan around this $1.2 trillion of funding. Agreed?
So, Sean, in that area, just alone, if you're looking at arguably what could be considered falling into the cluster category, is $5 billion going, just alone for the Advanced Research Projects Agency for infrastructure. So anything, and I don't know how they're going to be letting out the funding for this, but it's going to be universities that can compete, companies, foundations that are looking at these concepts that are game changers or concepts that could lead to a variety of innovations. And I think the clusters is a great area for that. And again, even for $5 billion, I mean that's a lot of money. And we're talking, I think, like you've described well, a company getting $10 million, $5 million to examine something and to further develop it is a lot of money. Well, imagine $5 billion over the next several years going for that. There's going to be a lot of opportunity to go after that money.
And also tied to this is the relationships that if you're both a public and or a private entity, that you're going to need inside these organizations. And that's really our specialty, and our expertise was really the foundation of the LSI methodology over the last 50 years, penetrating the Department of Transportation, EPA, Department of Energy, DOD, HHS, DHS, Commerce, SBA, Department of Interior, those entities that are going to have oversight and responsibility for managing and reporting back to the Congress on job creation. That's the other piece of this. Who is your customer? Who is the decision maker within these entities? And penetrating that in preparation for capturing this business. So anything else that you have in mind with capture? I mean, there's a lot to this. We're sort of consolidating this into a few minutes of discussion, but anything else in capture?
I think we can go through specific, these broader categories and outline a strategy for each one so that people can start to think about who they can approach and how to approach it.
Awesome. Now, moving into the proposal phase, one of the things that we keep hearing from a lot of our contacts and connections, our relationships inside of these entities, is that they're just going to replicate what happened with the CARES Act and the stimulus funding, where billions of dollars were contracted to public and private entities, to government entities and businesses as grants. And the reason that they did this was they didn't have time to do a 12-month procurement cycle to contract under the FAR and build it out of a whole acquisition strategy plan and build out, industry days and the typical FAR-based acquisition and we're accustomed to. So how they did that, and the entity that was really amazing in this was HHS, Health and Human Services. They were granting billions of dollars and obligating billions of dollars on a 30-page proposal for these grants. And so what we've heard is a lot of these entities are already saying that's how we're going to obligate these funds to state municipal entities and to private industries as well. So I think it's going to be a different proposal approach. Instead of us building out these very technical 500-page proposals, 1,000-page proposals, that's not going to be the case. Most of this is going to be 30-page proposals, which our team has really become the leaders in this industry in providing proposal development consulting. Because of our capture work, because of our integration into these entities, we're then able to build winning proposals to capture this funding through these grants. And the grant capture and grant proposal is a discipline unlike other proposal development. And you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. So as you described well, is that, how this funding is going to go out, particularly to this, it will be several things. It will be grants based upon what we talked about, formula grants. And those are given out every year. And they basically are given to states and state and local governments on formulas and metrics. Those aren't changing. Those will go out, and a state will get more than they have in the past, of course, but it will go out based upon a formula. The second area are these what we call grants that are competitive. These are what we need to the the first one as well, but the second one is they're going to be going out awarded to state and local governments based on a competitive application process.
Right.
So that's where we can play a role as well. There's going to be a lot of money going out to capture this type of funding for specific focus areas. And in some agencies, that's more than what a state gets just through their current allocation. And then you have just other way monies going out that are funding things. And we talked about the Highway Trust Fund, which states get pursuant, to what they've already getting, and then loans. So
the port funding, yeah.
So what we want to be focused, I think once we recognize how that money is going to be allocated competitively, we can then work with a variety of entities with the appropriate state and local entities when that money is being allocated to then go after that.
And it's not, I think that even if you're a small municipality or you're a small economic development organization or even a small business and you're thinking, oh my goodness, how do I tap into some of these funds? It's not going to take a lot of effort and a long period of time to put this together. Most of these proposals that we have worked in the last year and a half, 2 years, have been 30-page proposals, and they have obligated billions of dollars in funding around a 30-page proposal. So get a hold of us and let us know how we can help you if you're either a public entity or a business. And then if you're a business, one of the things that I keep saying, we're out of time on this, but one of the things as a business that you need to be cognizant about is, and while it's still early, what we're anticipating, what we expect is all of these entities are going to have small business requirements. Many of these grants or contracts will be small business set aside, 8A set aside, tribally set aside. So if you're a tribal entity, if you're a 8A corporation, if you're a small business, be thinking about that. If you're a large business, as part of your overall capture strategy and plan, be thinking about this funding that will be small business set aside, 8A set aside, tribally set aside, and all of the other, there's probably going to be some SDVO, small disadvantaged veteran-owned business set-asides as well. But you need to be prepared for that. If you're a large business, how do you partner with one of those entities? If you're a small business or an 8A or tribal entity, or if you're a tribal nation, even that's a whole nother discussion that we probably could dedicate a whole episode just to what are the tribal nations going to see from this, because I expect it'll be huge. Any thoughts on that element? Because this will be a big part of this, as you know.
No, completely concur with what you've said. There's going to be plenty of different types of set-asides for different populations, as well as populations who can win the money, but populations who can only, where the money has to be allocated within an area. So we can focus in on all those as well.
And then we haven't talked about program execution, but this will be a big part of that as well, especially in the job creation piece of that. That'll go into some of our social impact work, our demographic work with refugees, with the homeless, the displaced workers, veterans, and military spouses, our tribal entities that we had talked about. There's a lot of demographic work that as a public entity and even as a private entity that we're really positioned to support well. Why I'm excited about this for our company, for our clients in both the public and private sectors is it really touches every element in the LSI toolbox. It touches strategy, process, training, all the capture, which is going to be a huge part of this. proposal development, program execution, our economic development work, social impact, just the job creation across all of those entities, all of those disciplines, I think is going to be a huge opportunity. So anything else as we wrap this up, Josh? We've
No,
covered
that's
a
good.
lot. We have covered a lot. And I knew this is what you and I were going to end up going through in this. Let me just, I know there's a lot of people, even in our organization, that are very concerned about what does this mean long term? We've spent now $4 trillion in recovery from COVID. What does this look like? I'm an economist and think like an economist. I'm an economist at heart. So I'm always thinking of this long-term impact. What does this mean in 50 years? I'm not really sure what it means in 50 years, but let me just offer an observation. 2 weeks ago, I was in Iceland, and Iceland it's an interesting country. It's an island. It's an island that has 350,000 residents, but it's a good crucible for some history and in a lot of things: energy, environmental issues, economic development, and social impact. But one of the things that I didn't understand was that as I met with a lot of individuals in Iceland, Iceland was historically the poorest country in Europe until World War II. It was such a poor country. There was nothing. There were no natural resources there. There was no commerce. It was all agriculture. It was consistently one of the poorest countries. And what changed that? I kept asking over and over, what changed Iceland from being one of the poorest countries to one of the most affluent countries now in Europe? And the history, they've had a lot of economic ups and downs over the years, the financial collapse that happened a few years ago. But I can tell you now, they're one of the most affluent countries per capita in Europe. What changed was the investment that Iceland received from the Marshall Plan following World War II. And they played a very minor role in World War II, but they allowed both the UK and the US to establish a presence there. And as a result of that, they did receive some Marshall Plan funding. That funding transformed Iceland, and it was the economic stimulus that turned them into one of the richest per capita countries in the world. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen. As an economist, I think, and this work that we do in business development, economic development, and social impact, I've got a lot of ideas, but just keep that in mind, that was a real example of infrastructure investment that was very similar to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that we've discussed here, that was transformational. And maybe this will be for a lot of rural entities and historically depressed entities across the United States. I'm optimistic that'll be the case. Okay, anything else, Josh? I appreciate your work on this and your team's work. This was phenomenal, and we'll continue to have updates on how to build clusters around this act and funding. How, if you're a business or large business, small business, or tribal nation, tribal entity, how you can capture this funding and create jobs, which is really what this is about. Anything else that you want to discuss as we wrap up?
No, thanks for having me.
Josh, thank you. I appreciate it. So everyone, we covered a lot of ground. There was a lot to this. If you are a public entity, if you are a private entity, if you have an interest in any of these services or commodities that we've discussed tied to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, if you need help with information in the Congress, in penetrating any of the agencies, in building a capture strategy, a capture plan, in responding to these proposals for grants and contracts, these RFPs that are going to be dropping, there'll be thousands of RFPs tied to this that are going to drop, and the funding will be allocated through these grants. You're going to need proposal support. Let us know. And then program execution. If you're interested in any of our social impact work around demographic job creation or geographic ecosystem development, please connect with us. We will get back to you quickly. Thanks again, Josh. This was incredible. I appreciate your work on this.
Thanks.